Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another evening of PianoFest 2021, where the majority of our events are indeed happening live and in person in Gans Hall. But I'm so delighted for this presentation that we have our esteemed CCPA piano faculty member, Dr. Wael Farouk, presenting this presentation over Zoom. I actually feel like these presentations are even more effective in this kind of manner because there's much more immediacy. And it allows, of course, screen sharing and sharing different performances. And I'll hand it over to him in just one moment. But I can't speak enough about how much I cherish and adore having Dr. Farouk as a colleague. He's such a wonderful pianist, musician, artist, thinker. He's a real poet at the instrument, and yet he is capable of the phenomenal over and over again in terms of his repertoire, the size and scope of it, and also the depth that he brings to his interpretations. So I'd like to hand this over to Dr. Farouk, as this will be his presentation. So thank you for joining us, everybody.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Choi, for this wonderful and warm introduction. I am more than honored to be on the CCPA faculty and to have you as a colleague, as well as all of our wonderful colleagues. And good evening, everyone. And it's wonderful to see you and to have you, even though it is over Zoom. But like Dr. Choi just said, the majority of the events are happening in person. So this is still a good opportunity, a good medium for such presentation to take over Zoom, to allow us to take advantage of the technology and share and share screen, share audio, and share information and ideas. So the topic of this evening, as you know, is Egyptian composers, particularly Egyptian piano music by Egyptian composers. And this is a very close topic to my heart, obviously. And I have to say, I have not spoken about this before. I have performed tons of Egyptian piano music by Egyptian composers. I have worked with many of the living composers, and I have premiered several works, not only by living composers, but by composers who are no longer with us, but unfortunately their music has not seen the light of day. And to say just a few words about that first, I believe that unless you are German, Russian, or French, you tend to play a lot less of your country's music. And several people have pointed this out, but I feel that once you make it a mission to work with living composers, especially, our whole concept and understanding of music expands tremendously, because even though very few people today will work with the likes of Boulez or Ligeti or Balcom or etc., but the creative process is very similar. And once you get to learn and observe how composers think about their own music, and several of them even are very open to view their music through the performer's lens, as long as the performer is well equipped and well informed about all sorts of style, but particularly about that one composer's language. The learning process doubles its value, because you get a glimpses in how, for example, Beethoven or Schumann or Chopin would have thought of their own music as well. So this experience of working with living composers is really invaluable. And this is one of the things I I admire and applaud Dr. Choi about, because he always insists that students do perform works by fellow students at CCPA. And this is something remarkable, because not only these are your future colleagues, but it gives you something that working with just the traditional canon doesn't. So anyway, so the entire classical music scene in Egypt has been quite active since the 19th century. And I will get a little more in depth about that in a minute. But very few people are aware that there are indeed Egyptian classical music and there are Egyptian classical composers. Just like they are usually surprised when they find out that there is an Egyptian classical pianist. And many people do not know, for example, that the opera Aida was seen its world premiere in Egypt in the 1870s. And many people do not know that Aram Khachaturian visited Egypt, Bartok visited Egypt, Hindemith visited Egypt, Tchaikovsky visited Egypt, Saint-Saëns visited Egypt, Heifetz, Louis Armstrong, you name it, and amongst many other musicians. So the classical scene in Egypt was very, very active in the 1860s, when the ruler of Egypt at the time, who was a descendant of Muhammad Ali, who was one of the famous characters in the Ottoman Empire, he decided to build a massive opera house in honor of the opening of the Suez Canal. And he invited Verdi to write that great work, to write Aida, and invited Verdi and invited all of the royalties of Europe to witness this event. And that opera house was quite magnificent. And then in the early 20th century, some of the names I mentioned that visited Cairo, but you had William Furtwängler came with the Berlin Philharmonic and performed in Egypt. Actually, the 8 years old Daniel Barenboim played for Furtwängler in Cairo, Egypt. David Oistrakh came to Egypt. Yehudi Menuhin came to Egypt. Aram Khachaturian came to Egypt, as I mentioned, and so many others. So if I may share screen and start talking more about my slides here. What makes the Egyptian music unique? Or really, what is the Egyptian sound? What is the Egyptian voice? To be honest, nobody really knows for sure, because there were no traces of it. There were no notation. It's very different than Germany, per se, where you have music from the 1600s somewhat preserved, and you can find out exactly how it sounds, or in France, or even Russia. But that type of melting pot, which makes Egypt what it is and defines Egypt in so many levels, politically, culturally, geographically, is part of its strength and part of its uniqueness. So many of you, I'm sure, seen pictures of ancient Egyptian monuments, and it was very, very important for the pharaohs and for the ancient Egyptians to symbolize their instrument, their musical instruments. So it wasn't only a matter of entertainment for the royalty, for the kings and queens and the pharaohs, of Egypt, but it was actually a part of the rituals and religious offerings, if you will. So you will often see paintings and carvings of the flute, of the harp, of the lyre, and of drums, and of singing postures. And interestingly, they were mostly played by women. So women musicians, women composers, if you will, were already there. So religious influences or religious channels, Egypt is blessed with having a very unique geographical location, and partially that was a part of its curse, quote unquote, because being stationed in this strategic position always made Egypt a prey for colonizations, for invasions from the time of ancient Egyptians. So there are attempts of invading Egypt thousands of years ago already by the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Turks, French, English, so on and so forth. Religious influences. Egypt is one of the few countries in the Middle East that really witnessed active religious life of all three different religions at the time. First of all, Judaism. Of course, we know that Moses and the majority of Jews were at that time are living in Egypt, and then Christianity. After that, Egypt was officially the first country to go into Christianity. And in the 6th century, Egypt became a Muslim country. So, of course, each tradition and each religion and each type of ritual involves music. And each of these three religions has very unique, not entirely different approach to singing or to worshiping or to the use of instruments and the use of words and the singing and all of that, but somehow they are distinct, they are unique, they have their own characterization, but once again, you'll find this melting pot approach happening in the same country. Cultural influences, again, you have the massive, long, ancient Egyptian history with strides and very advanced knowledge of astronomy, math, architecture, religion. Then when the Arabs came, and when Europe was suffering, being in the Dark Ages and Renaissance and all of that, that was the height of the Arabic world in terms of science and medicine. The first cataract surgery was performed in the Middle East way before Europe. A lot of mathematical inventions, mathematical advances, theories, etc., etc. So Egypt was a hub and was a center and was a lighthouse, if you will, for all of destinations, for all scientists, for all adventurers, for all those who are interested in mysteries and myth and history and all of that would go to Egypt. And whether you can help it or not, whoever visited Egypt at the time, whether friend or foe, left their print. And of course, left something and took something. Some people took a lot more than others, but that's a topic for a different day. Geographical influences, of course, we have the Mediterranean influence, we have the Arabic influence, we have the Upper Egyptian influence, we have European influences, you have Greek, Roman, once again, as I mentioned, Arabs, Spanish, Moors, all of that left and contributed greatly to the so-called Egyptian sound of the time. Egypt is one of the richest countries in terms of folk music, and that's partially what compelled Bela Bartok and Hindemith to visit Egypt in the 30s for this big conference, so-called the Arabic Music Conference. And as you know, Bartok was fascinated, and it was one of his life's great works and great missions is ethnomusicology, and to go around, record and document and notate these folk music, either in Romania or Egypt or Hungary or whatever else. So having that background in a way makes the Egyptian musical sound and all-encompassing. One of the things I want to quickly touch upon, there is a wide theory that the Christian Coptic music is perhaps the closest of how ancient Egyptian music sounded like. The language, the Coptic language, has similarities to the hieroglyphic language. And it is very monophonic music, so there is no harmony, there is no counterpoint. And it is mostly chant, a little different than Gregorian chant, but similar in spirit. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that since that's the ongoing theory. So for today, I prepared 4 examples. Four examples of piano music, and these examples vary a lot in its origin and in terms of compositions, the treatment of the instrument, the inspiration. And I don't want to speak too much about the music. I want you to hear it and draw your own ideas and conclusions. I'm happy to answer questions as much as I can at the end. But to give you a brief summary about each composer, and while I'm playing the recording, I'm going to leave their brief bio there. The first composer, Abu Bakr Khairat, who was actually not a professional musician, but I chose his works because they're quite beautiful and very well written for the piano. He was an architect by profession. He actually is the person who built and designed the Cairo Conservatory in the late 50s and became its first dean. He was an amateur pianist, little more than an amateur composer, but his music was very much not aiming, at least in these works, to capture that authentic folkloric Egyptian traditional music. And I do not see anything wrong in that. I feel you can always approach music in so many different ways. Even the Russians had, what do you call it? Had some grievances about whether Tchaikovsky was purely Russian or not, or like Turgenev or Pushkin, which one is more Russian, which one is more European. And they're both great composer, whether it's Tchaikovsky, Borodin, or Korsakov. But at the same time, this man's mission, or what he was hoping to accomplish is quite sincere, quite beautiful. The four pieces are called lyrical etudes, and the first one is in C minor, the second one is in A minor, the third one is in C minor again, and the last one is in A major. You will hear a lot of Schumann-esque, Mendelssohn, slightly bit of Chopin's here and there, but without further ado, here are the pieces. And all four etudes will take about 10 minutes or so. Okay. All right. Thank you. So to answer a question that was in the chat, there isn't a video. It's I should have mentioned this earlier. It's a live performance of yours truly. It was a while back, almost 20 years ago, of a recital of all Egyptian composers. So unfortunately, there isn't a video of 3 out of the 4 uh, examples that I'm using today, but the last one will make up for it. It's by Lamis, and it's professionally taped, and of course she plays wonderfully, so at least there is one video there. So anyway, would anybody care to share a comment or an observation? Because I am almost 100% certain none of you heard this music before. If not, we can wait till the end if you'd rather.
I just put a note in the chat box for everybody to feel free to type in the chat box as well, and formulate some questions as you listen to the next few pieces.
All right. So Abu Bakr Khairat, in a way, is the first generation composer, and you heard his treatment for the piano and how clear the melodies are and how supportive, let's say, the left hand is of the right hand. Nothing too revolutionary, nothing too polyphonic. It is beautiful, it is lyrical in the style of Songs Without Words, if you will, by Felix or Fanny. The next work is one of the closest to my heart for several reasons, but I also feel it is one of the pieces that equally fuses the rich folk sound and traditions of Egypt, as well as European traditions by someone who is very intelligent, very creative, who studied well in the Soviet Union at the time. And astonishingly, he was not really a pianist, he was a violinist, Aziz Shawan. And he had an accident actually in his left hand, paralyzing one of his fingers, so he could not be a violinist anymore. So he focused more on composition. I had not had the pleasure of meeting him, but I came to know his wife very well. And she told me the story of Shawan going to study in Russia as follows. In the 50s, Aram Khachaturian came with the Russian state orchestra to Egypt, and he was conducting a concert of Russian programs, and of course, including his own works. And backstage waited him, this young, ambitious composer, and showed him some of his scores. And immediately Khachaturian offered if he would be willing to go to Russia and study with him personally. And his wife told me, of course, I was very happy for Aziz, but I was 2 months pregnant. And him leaving at that time for a year or two wasn't really the most opportune time, but it was a lifetime opportunity, right? So anyway, at a drop of a hat, Ilshawan packed up his bags, went to Russia and studied with Khachaturian. And in the 50s, Russia still at its, heights. Shostakovich was alive. Prokofiev was alive at least till 53. All other great composers, with pianists, violinists, cellists are still around. So it was a glorious time to be at. The first time I heard this piece was completely by chance. And the story goes like that. I just returned from a trip to Japan. I was 12 years old. I got a prize in a composition competition, and getting some gifts and presents and little, ceremony from the Ministry of Culture. I got a couple of tape cassettes. And one of those cassettes was entirely dedicated to Ilshawan's music. And they went home and they put the tape right away. I was 12 at the time. So I put the tape and I listened to it. And it was the first piano concerto. It was only the first movement of the first piano concerto, but it was conducted by Khachaturian himself and by the Russian State Orchestra and Alexander Bakhachev, who was a very well-known and respected Russian pianist at the time. And of course, I was blown away. It sounds very Egyptian, but also very Russian. You'll find a lot of similarities between, a little bit of Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky and Khachaturian as well. But so what? But the work is quite magnificent and it's quite beautiful. 8 years later, I was asked to perform it. I was actually the first Egyptian ever to play this piece, which was written in the mid-50s, and I got to perform it for the first time 2001, so almost half a century later. Then the performance that I'm going to play for you, it was actually a part of a European tour in Germany and the Czech Republic, where I got to perform this concerto about 8 or 9 times. And I will only play for you the first movement because the entire piece is around 40 minutes or so. And the orchestra is the North Czech Philharmonic and the conductor is Ahmed Said. So you will find more if you've seen the movie The Mummy, you're not going to find any of that ancient mummy fake, Hollywood Egyptian sounds in there, but you will find moments of really feeling that you are walking among some of those glorious temples with the obelisks or with the pyramids or something like that. He really captured that very uniquely and very, very artistically. So here it is.
You probably know me.
Sorry, commercial. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So I have to show you something that's also very special about this piece. It is not yet printed. So this is the score, the manuscript that I had to learn from. So imagine 40 minutes or so of music, not quite easy, as you may heard, complex music, and you just have to read it by the hand, by the composer's hand. Yes, it's inspiring to read exactly from his pen, but very difficult to decipher. There are a lot of things crossed, but anyway, one of my projects that I'm hoping to get to one day is to start publishing, first of all, notating on a professional software, this music, editing it, and then publishing it, or at least have it on with the composers or their family's permission, of course, on public domain, because there's so many music just like that, and it's a wonderful piece. So many music like that just yet have not been published almost 70 years later after they're written. So even the poor orchestra was also playing from handwritten parts and scores. So anyway, any thoughts or comments about the piece?
It's so first of all, bravo on such a wonderful performance. It's such florid writing, and it's hard to imagine that he was not a pianist. It's sound, whether it feels idiomatic or not, it sounds idiomatic, so well written for the instrument. And you already answered one of the questions in the chat box about how easy it is to find the scores of these composers. Very difficult, obviously, or virtually impossible. So I think your project would be wonderful to continue for the advocacy of this music and to get it out there.
Well, not only as a nationalistic duty, I feel like, since I am Egyptian, and not only championing or playing the music, but also making sure that it prospers and it lasts, and it's there for those who are interested to study it, or at least to know about it, or to be aware of it. All right, well, thank you for the comments and the questions. All right, now moving on to the third example. And so El-Shawan, we can safely call him the second generation of Egyptian composers. Now Gamal Abdurrahim, who was about 10 years younger almost, but more into the third generation. And by this time, you will have a very serious and really complex musical mind. I'm not saying that the previous two weren't serious nor complex, but you have somebody here not only was the first head of a composition department at the Cairo Conservatory. Well, remember that the French and the Egyptian really occupied Egypt for the majority of, 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. And the Brits were in Egypt till 1952. And after the Egyptian revolution at the time, and we had our first president in the early 50s, then the country started, probably for the first time in thousands of years, to be not occupied or to be oppressively ruled. So you can say since the 50s, those who were in charge in the leadership started to build the cultural infrastructure. The scene in Egypt at the time was really split in three tiers, if you will. You'll have those leftover nobilities and aristocracy who were very much westernized, pro-England, pro-France. Actually, I was born in the 80s, right? My first passport was written in French, was not written in English. And it was handwritten. My name, my date of birth, all of that was written by hand. So not till I had renewed my second passport, late 90s, that the second language was officially now English. And the passport was printed and typed and all of that. So even though the country is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, but because it's been under so much colonization and, it's been robbed out of resources and many other things, there is still a lot of catching on to do and catching up to do. So it might seem awfully late, but as late, or you can say as early as the 1950s, that's where we had our first music conservatory. And that in itself was very interesting too, because of course we had to seek European aid to help us to teach first generations musicians. So we had Italians, we had Russians, we had Germans, we had Hungarians. It was wonderful because in one place you get to have all those different schools of thinking. The Italians taught music theory and taught piano, and the Hungarians taught ethnomusicology, and the German taught musicology and music history. The Russians taught the instruments. So it was, you had the best of European musical traditions in one building, in one place. So Gamal Abdurrahim was the founder of the composition department at the conservatory, and he went to Germany and he studied with a student of Hindemith. He was very much in the tradition of Bartok. He was actually nicknamed the Egyptian Bartok, but he very skillfully was able to fuse again those folk-like elements with the complex avant-garde tradition that was going on at the time. He's the first composer to write in 12-tone style, serial music. So anyway, the piece that I'm going to play for you is also a live performance that I gave at Carnegie Hall in 2013. And it is titled "To Our Revolution's Martyrs." Martyrs, as you know, are those who die, not just killed in wars, but in a way they sacrifice themselves for a cause, for a specific cause. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when the Middle East was fighting off European colonization, right? France, Italy, and England. Egypt was sending on and on and on military aid to those countries, like the Algerian Revolution, the Libyan War, the Syrian War, etc., etc. And so many thousands and thousands and thousands of these soldiers never returned, and they were all died in these wars. So that work is dedicated to them, and it's in two movements. And of course, around 2013, that was almost a year and a half, 2 years, 2 years and a half after the Egyptian Revolution in 2011. So I thought that piece will be fitting to include in the program. So it's in two movements. The first movement is called Lament, and the second movement is called Conflict. Here it is. Thank you. And that's not, it's quite intense music, obviously, as the title. And I think he really captured not only the mood of the piece, the lamentation and elegy like the first movement, but really the heartbreak. You can hear the mourning, you can hear the crying, you can hear the weeping, and you hear the conflict of the second movement. Conflict could really mean so many things at this time, politically, internal conflict and all of that, but he was able to fuse all of this with really wonderful European and authentic Egyptian flavor that's very unique. I think this is one of the best, in my humble opinion, one of the best solo works for the Egyptian repertoire that I know of anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a masterpiece. It's really fantastic, so well written, and it's just layer upon layer, and stunning performance too. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'm assuming this is a score that's probably a little easier to find.
Yes, this one, it's still not uh modern edition's been published, but it's not a handwritten score. I have that typed and printed, thankfully. I didn't come across this version that you can purchase of the online or from music stores. There is another piece by him. It's a variation for piano on an Egyptian folk song. This one is actually published in one of the 4 or 5 volumes. I think they're called the African Masterpieces or African Diaspora. There are 5 volumes of African composers, and Gamal Abdurrahim is included in there. Yeah. All right. So I will say a couple of words about the last piece, but I will let Lamis introduce it in more detailed version, and we'll get to watch her performance. So Amr Okba is one of the brightest and definitely unique young Egyptian composer. I knew him actually as a student at the Cairo Conservatory. He's a few years older than I am. In the 90s, when I was in middle school, early high school, he was finishing his bachelor's and doing his graduate studies. And one thing that I am very thankful for my teachers and for how the conservatory set up interaction between students, especially between the performance department and the composition department. They made sure that every semester students would perform the composer students piece. And that's when I got to meet Amr for the first time and played his music and worked with him. And as I mentioned in my introduction, how open he was for suggestions, especially because he is not a pianist. So you can not only do things by instinct when you perform them, but he was very receptive of suggestions, or even the smallest details like pedaling, fingering, articulations, phrasing. And that was not only very nice of him to be receptive of, but also give me an idea or an inclination how interpreters really have a big responsibility and a big mission in deciphering the music, and composers, as geniuses as they all are, and as complete as the scores and the masterpieces they wrote, there is still a lot of room for the interpreter to bring it to life and to bring our own experiences and our own voice, if you will, to the piece, which, as long as it's well informed and as long as it's appropriate in the style, I don't think it distort or distract from the intention. So without further ado, I will let Lamis take over and I will get her piece ready.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay, so my name is Lamis. I was introduced to this composer because he was my teacher in my undergrad. But then after I graduated, around 2 years after I graduated, he asked me to play one of his pieces, and that was last June, which is the piece you're going to listen today. The piece is called FBI, Facebook Information. And based on the composer's introduction to it, so as many of you might know, the newest Egyptian revolution took place back in January 2011 in Egypt, when actually a group of young men and women created an event on Facebook and said, we're going to go out and protest against dictatorship. Come join us on the 25th of January, which marks Police Day in Egypt. And through Facebook, so many people knew about this event. Then on the decided day, around 2 million were in the streets. And they kept going out every day until within a week, they became more than 10 million. And after 2 weeks, the government actually resigned. A few more things happened after that, as so many good things, so many like bad things happen also. But you can see how Facebook can connect people to create something very miraculous like this. But it also can be a way of spreading chaos among a society. So through this composition, the composer just tells a story of a young person who is trying to reach their dream. So this person goes on several attempts and several failures until this person is filled with rage and anger and decides to protest against the obstacles. And this portrays the story of every person who was walking in the streets in January 2011, hoping they could make a change. And Facebook has connected them, but also after the whole revolution, there was several things, contrasting things that have happened. The melodic material of the piece is short segments put together to form episodes. Each episode is an attempt, and therefore, as we go through the piece, the episodes get a slightly little longer, and they also have more patience, resistance, and insistence in them. Therefore, the intensity increases a little bit. As we reach the climax, we reach the revolution. And as we go through the climax towards the end of the piece, we get to experience tension, release, excitement, and chaos as consequences of what had just happened. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Amis. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
So I hope that somehow today, with those 4 different pieces, 4 different generation styles, and 4 different schools of thoughts, and of course, one thing is common between all of them, that they are Egyptian. They're trying to make their own, to create their own voice, I will say, to forge their own voice. It is not an easy thing when you come from a country usually that is not identified as the most Western, musically speaking, accessible, or has a strong background in that area. But I believe today's selection is a very good example and good evidence of how wonderful these pieces are, and they deserve to be heard, and or at least to be known and for people to be aware of. But more than this, in general, if you are from a place that is usually not associated with Western powerhouse composers, I believe it's your duty as well to champion your country's music, your fellow composers, those you know, whether you're during your student years or those who are well known and prominent, because this is a part of our missions as interpreters. Of course, yes, it's wonderful to hear the Waldestein one more time or the Appassionato one more time, but I think people will appreciate very much our contribution if they hear something that they never heard in their lives before, and sometimes they will never get a chance to unless you're able to take that upon yourself. So anyway, thank you all for your attention and your patience, and if you have any questions, either I or Lamis could try to answer them.
This is not a question, but more a comment, and we'll get to the question in a moment. I see Elizabeth has raised her hand, but the comment I wanted to make was regarding Lamis's performance. For those of you that don't know, that was done just last week in Gans Hall, and I do want to give some credit to our brilliant audio and video, Aaron Gottel from Atlas Arts, who is our in-house recording technician, and he recorded that. And this was done in one take. Lamis just ran the piece a couple of times, and then the video was spliced together from multiple angles. But yeah, a fantastic performance. Congratulations, Lamis. Very psychologically powerful piece. I see a question from, I think it was Elizabeth that raised her hand.
Hi. Yeah, I would like to say that this was an amazing presentation, and I really enjoyed, especially the historical aspect of it from multiple composers who became more modern. And I would just like to say I would like to see more of these presentations of composers away from our Western tradition, away from the Western canon. I think that would help us a lot.
I agree. Well, thank you for your comments and for your words. That is encouraging, and we'll do our best to have more of those in the future.
We are blessed to have, as pianists, so much fantastic repertoire. So sometimes it's so all-consuming that we can stay just within the canon that can consume us for a lifetime. But I think, as was made clear, there's so much outside of the canon, the so-called canon, that deserves to be explored. And so many unique voices and interesting voices and important voices that have substantial things to say. So we should all gather, I guess, this message of curiosity to seek out what's right around us, what's surrounding us, from our fellow countrymen to places we visited to those that we get to know and grow up with, and And there's a lot of incredible art that's being created out there. All right. Well, I think that looks like it's the end of our questions. Many nice comments in the chat box from various people that have attended. So I'd like to thank everybody, especially, of course, Dr. Farouk for his wonderful and brilliant presentation, and as well as his student Lemis, who performed so wonderfully. So thank you for your performances, both of you, and have a good night, everybody.